Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with the top 5 modern decks for the end of October / beginning of November 2022 as we're wrapping up Dominaria United modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative modern videos, please consider subscribing to our channel, give me a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below. And just remember, your deck is S tier and everything else is trash. On a serious note, obviously the meta has gotten shaken up this month with the banning of Yorion, the Sky Nomad. Well, it didn't overly affect the meta in terms of, there were a certain number of decks running it, things like mostly the 4-color Omnath piles, the new Leyline Binding based Rhinos decks, and some other basically value mid-range decks were trying to run Yorion. And while it didn't overly affect that, it did force them to kind of recalibrate and renew kind of where they are in the meta. So those decks have kind of been shaken up from the top of the meta, and things have kind of been shaken up a little bit. One of two decks that have consistently performed very well despite the presence of Yorion, or with or without it in the format, has been Indomitable Creativity. Now, Creativity is a deck that has existed for some amount of time. When this deck first started to pop up, it was mainly a Velomachus turns deck, trying to Creativity into Velomachus and then cast some number of Time Warps and savor the moments to win the game. Then iterated into Emrakul and Serra's Emissary as a way to kind of protect the Emrakul from removal spells. And then finally it settled upon a series of creatures. Mostly it was Primeval Titan and Archon of Cruelty. We've done a video on what this deck's archetype is if you want to do a general overview of what the deck does, but as obviously some things have changed since that video has been made, but overall the deck tries to put some tokens into play, whether it be treasure tokens, clue tokens, dwarf tokens from Dwarven Mine, and then creativity into multiple creatures. The main threat that most people have settled on is Archon of Cruelty as the main deck threat, as it's just the overwhelming card advantage and forcing your opponent to sacrifice creatures, discard cards, while you're drawing cards, gaining life. The overall power of this card is truly insane. Now, there has been some counterplay to it. Things like Orvar, Veil of Summer, etc. have started to pop up more and more, but overall this is one of the best performing of the decks, and one of the decks that still best exploits Renin 6, which is a card that most people thought potentially could have been banned in place of something like Yorion. Beyond that, there are a couple different variants of the deck that see play. The one that you see on your screen is kind of the hybrid of both those versions, and usually those people are trying to play a white-based deck that's running Leyline Binding and Teferi Time Raveler to be able to resolve the combo at instant speed, or a version that's playing a little bit more black spells and is trying to resolve Persist if they discard things like with Prismari Command or Fabled Mirror Breaker, getting back their Archons in addition to the Indomitable Creativity plan. Overall, this deck is very powerful in the format, has a lot of positive matchups overall in the format, does have some struggles as it doesn't have a lot of spell-based interaction. That said, still is very powerful Archon of Cruelty. There are very few decks that can kind of go over the top of what it's doing. Obviously, decks like Tron or Amulet Titan can kind of match just the overwhelming power of this deck. But, overall this deck has been performing very well and is probably the current king of the Renin 6 Teferi Time Raveler soup decks that exist out there, including obviously the Omnath piles and some other decks. The first or second deck overall is a deck that a lot of us are familiar with, and that is Murktide Regent-based Izzet Tempo decks. Now these have taken on some different forms over the last several months, mostly revolving around the card Blood Moon or Archmage's Charm, and fighting over the space of the cards Ledger Shredder and Dragon Rage's Channeler. Other than that, this deck has been a staple since Modern Horizons 2, with the printing of both Ragavan and Murktide Regent. It is a tempo-based deck, tries to use red-based removal like Unholy Heat and Bolt to keep your opponent's creatures at bay, while using things like Counterspell, Spell Pierce, Archmage's Charm to keep your opponent's spells off the stack. In recent notes with Leyline Binding, making cards like Murktide Regent and Ledger Shredder a little bit worse, the card Blood Moon has been creeping back into the main deck. This card that was previously more of a sideboard card, but is seeing more play in the main deck because obviously the 4 and 5 color mana bases make it a lot more hostile for a card like Blood Moon. This is a deck that kind of dipped in last month's standings, but is a deck that has resurged a little bit as kind of those 4 and 5 color soup decks try to find themselves in the banning of Yorion This is a deck that is always fairly well positioned, although never possibly the best deck of a given weekend. It's still a deck that a competent pilot can expect to do very well with, and a deck that you're going to see plenty of in big events that you might be attending. Another deck that's consistently in the top 5, and you can debate where this deck fits in the current meta, is Hammer Time. It is a aggressive combo deck that pairs, obviously, the power of Urza's Saga with Sigarda's Aid, Pure Steel Paladin, in order to equip a Colossus Hammer to a creature and get your opponent dead quickly. So it has this kind of like get you dead quickly plan while also having this kind of somewhat resilient grindy plan against the removal heavy base decks like the 4-color soup piles or creativity that we run into. That said, it comes in a couple different variants, the blue-white variant and the mono-white variant. Blue-white has a little bit worse mana base for a little bit things like Spell Pierce and some sideboard cards, and a card like Reality Chip do a little bit more card advantage stuff. The mono-white version has a little bit better mana base, plays things like Blacksmith Skill as its protection, along with things like Giver of Runes, etc. But the overall plan of the deck is very simple. You try to find a hammer, you put it on something, you boink them to death. But beyond that, you still have some decent things. You have things like Stoneforge Mystic for Galtera Complete. Some versions play Niddlecest. And then, you have other equipment such as Shadow Spear, Sword of Fire and Ice, etc. that you might see play in some of these decks. And then overall, this just kind of has the old combination of Affinity plus Infect vibe, as you have that one-shot kill with Inkmoth Nexus. This is kind of the spiritual successor to those decks, and a deck that does well, because it has cheap counterplay to what your opponent's playing, while also having a fairly low-to-the-ground game plan that can kill you quite quickly and still play a little bit of a grindy game in the meantime. Another deck to be aware of is a Yawgmoth combo. This is a deck that has been in and out of our top 5 at points, along with decks like Amulet Titan. It is a creature-based combo deck that tries to use Yawgmoth for imposition with undying creatures to kill your opponent, either with Blood Artist or Geralf's Messenger, infinitely dealing damage to your opponent. Or I shouldn't say infinitely, but usually killing your opponent out of nowhere. Blood Artist with 2 undying creatures is infinite. Geralf's Messenger and another undying creature is, as long as you have a higher life total than your opponent, is lethal. It uses resilient things like the Hunger Tide, Strangleroot Geist, Young Wolf, Geralf's Messenger to kind of play a resilient backup beatdown plan, and then it has tons of different toolbox things with Court of Calling and Eldritch Evolution, allowing you to find the missing piece of your particular combo. And then you round that out with mana dorks like Birds of Paradise, Ignoble Hierarch, and Wolverines to get your game plan off the ground a little bit earlier. This is a deck that is continuing to play very well into these 4 and 5 color soup piles, simply because it's such a resilient deck. It does have a few bad matchups throughout the meta, but it is a deck that has continued to perform well here and there. The main thing holding it back is the skill that it takes to take this deck. This deck is a little bit different than a lot of the other decks. The Omnath soup piles tend to be a little bit more controlling, and you have a lot of game actions, but the overall power of the individual cards is very high. Creativity has a very simple game plan to execute, and you're just kind of trying to stay alive till the end. Murktide's a lot of a game of Protect the Queen. Yawgmoth is a little bit different in terms of what it's trying to execute. This is a creature-based combo that requires multiple pieces. You need to play around your opponent's interaction the best of your possible, while also having this kind of resilient, slow beatdown plan. This deck overall is very powerful. It's been in the hands of many different pilots, mainly Demonic Tutors, and there are some others that do it. But this is a deck to be aware of, and a deck certainly that can be considered in the top 5 of the current modern meta. Jeskai Breach is another deck that can be considered in the top 5. This deck is kind of along the lines of Rakdos Scam. It's one of those decks that pops up. It will do well for a couple weeks and then kind of slide back down as people kind of hit it with targeted hate. It's a deck that combines things like Ragavan, Ledger Shredder, and Emery to kind of pressure your opponent to interacting with that, and then threatens to win the game out of nowhere with Grinding Station, a 0-mana artifact, and either Grape Shot or Thassa's Oracle to kind of win the game from there. This deck kind of attacks you on multiple angles, is a little bit weak to Graveyard Hate, so it can be a flash in the pan some weekends, as Graveyard Hate can make this deck significantly worse, especially if you back it up with some type of removal for most of their creatures. But that said, it still has the very powerful Izzet Shell, that we're familiar with out of the Izzet Murktide decks with Ragavan and Ledger Shredder. So this is a deck that can put on multiple angles of attack and force your opponent to respond. Much like Rakdos Scam, it does try to leverage an early game plan while having a somewhat resilient mid-range game plan, but not quite as good as the full tempo deck that Izzet Murktide is. But it is a deck, that it hits from multiple angles. It can win the game very quickly while still having a resilient mid-game plan. It's kind of, if you're noticing, that's kind of a theme in the modern format right now. You need to be able to win the game fairly quickly for the most part, while also being able to kind of grind out the plans against the 4-color or 5-color soup decks. Another deck you should obviously be aware of, the 4 or 5-color soup piles that we talk about, mostly revolve around the card Omnath, Lotus of Creation, and Wrenn and 6. Now obviously this deck has taken a bit of a hit in the form of losing Yorion the Sky Nomad. There's been some attempts to replace it with Karuga. There's been some attempts to replace it with a card like Kahira. They're still trying to settle on the specifics of what cards should and shouldn't make the cut in the 60 card version versus the 80 card version. But you're still seeing a lot of the same things. You're still seeing the core around Wrenn and 6, Teferi, Time Raveler, and Omnath, and Solitude. And then Leyline Binding has kind of worked its way in these lists after it's printing in Dominaria United. And then beyond that, it's how many counter spells do you want to play, how many bolts do you want to play, how many prismatic endings do you want to play, how many March of Other Worldly Lights do you want to play, etc. A lot of it is the finer details, trying to get the mana base right to work the 5-color mana base without taking too big of a hit. Obviously, some cards have been cut. Things like Icefang Quotal and such are no longer really played in the deck. But overall, this is still a very powerful deck that you should be aware of. It has a fairly decent matchup against Murktide and a lot of the other mid-range soup piles that, other than maybe creativity, that can go over the top of it. And, is a deck you should be aware of. There's also a variant of blue-white control that's been seeing some play that I really couldn't find any versions of. Basically, blue-white splashing Wrenn and 6 and Leyline Binding plays out a very similar game plan to what this deck's doing, other than obviously you don't have the Omnath kind of mid-range plan to work through. But, like I said, people are kind of still trying to figure out what the exact, what these new mid-range, 4-color mid-range soup piles. But once they are kind of coalesced into another form, I'm sure they will rise back to the top and become a, for sure, top 5 deck in the modern format. And then, always a contender you need to be aware of is these various Cascade decks, whether it be Living End or Rhinos. Both the decks have continued to perform reasonably well of late. There's no hard hate on them right now because they really haven't performed extremely well, and obviously the format was completely shaken up by the banning of Yorion. But, basically you're trying to cast all these various different Cascade spells, Shardless Agent or Violent Outburst, into Crashing Rhinos, and then backing that up with some type of tempo cards, Fire Ice, Dead Gone, Force of Negation. Some versions play Subtlety, and then using the newest version of the decks are playing Leyline Binding. Some versions are using Sign of Draco as another turn 2 or turn 3 play to pressure your opponent. Then obviously Fury here, kind of cleaning up your opponent's creatures. Obviously you need to be aware of Living End. Living End's a little bit more, has a little bit better of a game 1 plan, as resolving a Living End is quite very powerful. It's even more powerful than resolving 2/4/4 Rhinos, even with a Shardless Agent attached. That said, it has a little bit more hate to fight through if there's any type of graveyard hate out there. If there's any type of additionally Cascade hate out there, that deck has to fight through a little bit more. So I do think Rhinos is a little bit better position. Now, as far as how the meta shapes up overall right now, I do think Creativity and Murktide are the top 2 decks, and then however you want to form the other card decks around it, whether it be Hammer Time, Yawgmoth, the Omnath piles, the Grinding Station combo, all these other decks kind of circle around those decks, and as the Modern continues to kind of slowly churn, there isn't a ton of innovation in the format right now, but they're just still trying to find where does Omnath fit into things. A lot of people still think that Wrenn and 6 needs to go into a banning. Not going to get into that right now, but it's certainly a card to keep on your radar if you do decide to invest in these kind of mid-range piles. That I wouldn't be surprised if that's another card to go soon, as that is a card that is already banned in Legacy because obviously of its power with Wasteland. But that's kind of where Modern is toward the wrapping up end of Dominaria United Modern. We might have another one in the month of November. It's kind of a top 5 deck list once the new Set Brothers War comes out, and if there's any changes to the meta result of that. Looking like there might be a few cards that might change the format or shake it up a little bit. There's this new kind of Extraction-esque effect. It's a 2-mana artifact that costs 2 and tap, sacrifice it to activate it. That might shake things up for things like Eldrazi Tron or Tron, or other decks that are using Karn the Great Creator would certainly be interesting. But as to how big of an effect that would have on the format, I'm not quite sure. But as always, if you do like these informative Modern-based videos, please consider subscribing to the channel. And if you would like similar style Modern content, please consider looking at our sister channel, Pioneer Nexus MTG, where I cover a lot of the same things for the Pioneer format.